Hi, everybody. My name is Brian McLaren. It's a pleasure for me to get to present with my friend, Mark Charles. Mark has been a teacher to me. I've learned so much from him, a great friend and companion. And I should also say that I like to be around people where we balance out the hair karma of the universe. So may the spirit of the love of God be among us and fill us. Amen. May the spirit of curiosity be greater than the spirit of defensiveness. May the spirit of learning to teach be greater than just the desire to learn for learning's sake. And may the spirit of power and courage accompany everything we learn, because what we learn today will require power and courage to be able to be shared elsewhere. We'd like to talk about our history in this country and the history of white supremacy. And if you're interested in anything else about me, there are things I've done, you can check out my website. But I'd like to begin with a quote that really frames our whole weekend together from Dr. King. The deep rumblings that we hear today, the rumblings of discontent, is the thunder of disinherited masses rising from the dungeons of oppressions to the bright hills of freedom. All over the world, like a fever, freedom is spreading in the widest liberation movement in history. Spoken in August 1967. Those of us in the room who are older will actually remember this. For others, it's hard to believe that this happened so recently. But in the years after World War II, between 1945 and the early 1970s, the last official vestiges of colonialism ended. The last colonies of the British Empire gained their freedom. And in many ways, we take for granted how different the political world is now from the political world not very long ago. But you can change the politics without changing the heart. You can change the politics without changing the culture. And when we want to start thinking about how that wild and wide liberation movement can spread more broadly, we do have to pay attention to that last word in the quote, which is the word history. We could say that history is the story that we tell about our past, or the stories that we tell about our past. The great novelist Chimamanda Adichie, in probably, I think it's one of the most popular TED Talks of all times, said, "Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity." I grew up as a kid who loved three things. I loved music, I loved the outdoors, and I loved books. And I ended up being an English major because I think it's, in some way, I sense the power of stories to humanize the other. I sense the power of stories to help us see things about ourselves. It took me a while to realize that growing up as a Christian, I grew up in a fundamentalist background, and all the problems of fundamentalism, you do learn the Bible a lot, which can then really be helpful in undoing your fundamentalism. Especially when you read the verses in between the verses you're always taught to memorize. But I remember, learning all the parables of Jesus, and it dawned on me later that Jesus was a writer of fiction, because sometimes only by entering into the world of imagination through this literary form of parable can you free people to see the truth about their past and their present. And if you want to liberate them to live a different future, it really does require telling the truth about our past. Adichie went on to say, the single story creates, the single story creates stereotype. And the problem with stereotype is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. And they make one story become the only story. Then she goes on to say, the Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Now, in some ways, this is the playground phenomenon of the teacher grabs a kid by the arm and says, "Why were you punching, your playmate there?" And of course, it's, "He hit me first, but he called my mother's," and everybody starts tracing back. But we all have this sense, if we want justice, we have to somehow unearth the story that brings us to the point where we are today. The British and Indian poet Salman Rushdie said, "Those who do not have power over the story that dominates their lives, the power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change it as times change, truly are powerless because they cannot think new thoughts." Now, we have a lot of problems. We have policies that desperately need to be changed. We have politicians that desperately need to be changed. But if all of our policies and all of our politicians in many ways are expressions of the same old stories, if you don't change the stories, you can change the politicians and end up with remarkable resilience of the things we're trying to get rid of. And that's why I think one of the special jobs of faith communities is to try to tell liberating stories, to try to tell stories that break the power of the single stories that have oppressed us, the stories that have kept people from being able to think new thoughts. So that's why it ends up being tremendously important for us to find ways of transcending the single stories. And of course, one of America's famous and favorite stories is the story of the good guys versus the bad guys. And the good guys is always us, and the bad guys is always them. How can we transcend that power? When I was a pastor for 24 years, and again, one of the horrible things about being a pastor is if you actually read the Bible, it starts to work on you. And I started to realize that the Bible, and especially the Gospels, were full of these stories that were trying to account for reality, that were trying to be the single story that ran the show, and these stories were in conflict. And as this started to become clear to me, I've written about this in a number of my books, I started to see that the dominant story in Jesus' day was the story of domination, the us over them story of the Roman Empire. And for Jesus in the Gospels, his contemporaries, the Herodians and Sadducees, this was the story that they bought into largely. And it's the story that the only way to be safe is to have our people in control. Now, one of the geniuses of electoral democracy, of four-year election cycle, is that it always allows you the hope that if the other guys are in control, you can be in control in 4 years. But you understand, if you have two parties arguing about who's in control, every election cycle, they reinforce the shared belief that the secret to peace is being in control. Now, whenever you're the losers, and before democracy, when you didn't have 4 years to look forward to, the revolution story grows. And the revolution story is the story that if we could just get rid of them and replace them, we would then be in control. So in a way, it's an inversion of the domination story. But you have to understand, there are many people in the world that have lived for generations and centuries not being in control. And so the revolution story can grow very, very powerfully and define people's lives. And it is a powerful story with much truth to it. But unfortunately, when us overthrowing them is your main story, the story of history is about us getting to the place where we can someday overthrow them so that we can be in power and rule by violence. Somehow we haven't really been liberated from that story. What happens when your group is in control and you should be happy, everything should be right, and things aren't great? You need some handy scapegoat to blame. And so the purification story in the Gospels, this is represented by the religious elite who want to blame the prostitutes and the tax collectors and the drunks for all of our problems. And so today we know how that story is still alive. If we can, and people can live for generations with narratives of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, in today's world, homophobia, and transphobia, and all other kinds of ways of identifying a group of people, venting our anxieties and frustrations upon them so that we can maintain the myth that all things would be fine if it just weren't for them. The isolation story is a really, really popular one. It sort of is a backdrop for the four Gospels. The Essenes are in the background. John the Baptist sort of represents maybe someone who's departed from the Essene narrative, but it basically says, the problem is all those other people. We get it. We've got it right. And if us good people could just go somewhere and build a big wall, we would all be happy. Now, I know that it's hard to imagine that story existing today. But it's also, of course, the story that brought one part of the colonizers here. It was the story that we're oppressed in England and Europe, and if we could just find another place to go, we could be the city on a hill and have everything go our way. It's a really popular and attractive story. The accumulation story runs through all of this, and it's when people realize, those other stories are making a mess of the world. The only way to survive is to have a whole lot of money or a whole lot of land. And if you can get a lot of money and a lot of land, and maybe today, a lot of data. I do think the data has become a new kind of accumulative currency. Then you create, it's the best you can do in this world. And there are always people who can't make it in any of the other stories. And the victimization story is all that many of them are left with. And it's us at the mercy of them. And what's so interesting in the gospel stories is that Galileans seem to represent this group. And among the Galileans, the landless workers are really at the bottom, and the sick. For whom there's no health care, and all the rest, they're the most vulnerable. Interestingly, that Jesus seems to spend his most time with those people, and so much of his message. Did you ever notice that he didn't say with them, after he would perform a miracle in the gospel stories, "My faith has made you well"? Your faith has made you well. Do you understand this sense of building up the victimized to have some sense of their power? When the people are hungry in the story of the miraculous feeding, he doesn't say, "Get them in groups of 50 and I will feed them." He said, there's this sense of building up their hope. But because people who live in the victimization story for long enough have lost a sense of agency, they desperately need to become, as Paulo Freire said it, protagonists in their own narrative. Now, when we talk about the story of America, all of us are part of the drama of the white supremacist narrative that fused with the Christian religion and created this white Christian supremacy. In its Southern European form, it was predominantly Catholic. In its Northern European form, it was predominantly Protestant. And it has its roots, as Mark has written beautifully about and terrifyingly about. It has its roots way back in the 15th century, just a generation before Columbus, when Pope Nicholas gave what we might call his Great Commission, which was to go into all the world and make slaves of all nations and plunder all nations for the profit of the Christian European nations. That white supremacist narrative has been so tricky because it really is living out the domination narrative. But it is dominated so powerfully that it has colonized all the other narratives too. And I'll just tell you, if you just keep this in mind for the next few months and you listen to almost any political speech or any commentator who comes from a partisan background, on the news, what you'll find is that this narrative of white supremacy, it's a domination narrative, has found a way to say, whenever they're not in full control, they stage a revolution narrative. And so shortly after President Obama was elected, remember Mitch McConnell basically announced that they had a revolution strategy. Their only strategy was to make him unsuccessful. And my friend Frank Schaefer, I think, put it well, that we witnessed the slow motion lynching of President Obama. Whiteness finding a way to work in the revolution narrative. The purification narrative. It's just fascinating to watch that whenever our president gets in trouble, he's got a handy group of scapegoats that he pulls in so that he can present them as the problem. And of course, he can play the isolation game beautifully as well. He just, and the whole narrative of whiteness brilliantly colonizes every other story. The accumulation narrative, America First, which plays to this idea that the only time you're safe is when you have economic control. And then the victimization narrative. It's so interesting to watch these powerful people living in the narrative of whiteness to make themselves victims. It's fascinating. Now, for me, what became clear to me is that in the biblical narrative, there's this alternative narrative that arises in the very early chapters of the Bible. I think you can understand Genesis 1 as an early articulation of a liberation narrative, because if the empires of the world rule by power, and you find out that God actually likes naked hunter-gatherers, do you understand? It's saying that Black lives matter. It's saying naked, uncivilized lives matter. It's saying every human being matters. And in many ways, against the backdrop of the Egyptian and Assyrian empires, Genesis 1 is a revolutionary text. And you keep going through and you see the story of liberation grow and grow and grow to imagine us and them in right relationship and expanding us, that says, when Jackie preached this morning, our Father who art in heaven. And of course, we struggle with the word Father, with the problems of patriarchy, because patriarchy is deeply related with the domination narrative. To me, the really significant word is the word our. Because whether we have that hour being an exclusive hour or an all-inclusive hour, really interesting in the Sermon on the Mount, where one passage where that prayer comes, Jesus makes clear that the birds of the air and the flowers of the field are included in that hour. That the family in the universe is a family of all living things. That if you want to think of the family tree that you see when you look at a diagram of evolution, where all life is related, that actually is the ultimate framework for liberation. And so it raises the question for us: if we have 6 narratives that lead to violence, 6 narratives that in a sense keep us trapped, and then liberating narratives arise, how are we going to find a way to expose those destructive narratives and live by a new narrative of liberation? And in just a minute, Mark's going to come up, and he's going to, I think, do a masterful job of challenging us to realize how the narratives we tell in America are ways of keeping the old domination narrative alive, and how we now face the great struggle if we're going to have a new future, if there's going to be a new kind of America in the future, if we aren't going to keep relapsing into the old narratives of white patriarchal supremacy, Christian supremacy, and all that it entails, if we aren't going to keep slipping back, we're going to have to find a new way to tell stories about our past, as Adichie said, to stop letting a single narrative frame us, as Salman Rushdie said, so that we can again have power to be protagonists in our own story and imagine a different future. So would you all welcome Mark?
There is a very wise Aboriginal elder. His name is George Erasmus. And he says where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he says, you need to start by creating a common memory. I think this quote gets to the heart of our nation's problems regarding race, gender, and class, which is we do not have a common memory. We have a dominant, male, wealthy population that remembers one version of history, and we have the marginalized people of color, women, and other marginalized groups that have a whole nother understanding of history, and there's no common memory. And I think all of us can pretty much agree at the moment, national community pretty much sucks, right? So we need to find a way to create this common memory. Now, to do this, we have to do several things. So before I even get into my content, I need to have a baseline starting point. So the first thing we have to do is we have to switch our language. So one of the things I talk about a lot, we throw around the term racial reconciliation, right? Sounds beautiful, it sounds biblical, it sounds fantastic. People have created whole careers on this notion of racial reconciliation. I don't like the word. It's a misnomer. Race is a human construct. There's no genetic definition of race. And in America, race was constructed for the purpose of oppressing and dividing. The black race, the American Indian race, were constructed to oppress and divide. Reconciliation implies what? Previous harmony. Never existed. So I use the term racial conciliation. Reconciliation perpetuates the myth of America. We used to be great, now we're not. Conciliation, which is the mediation of a dispute, racial conciliation acknowledges the broken past and says, let's just try to build a better future. So I use this term. Second term I don't use the word white privilege. White privilege makes it sound like it's a blessing that needs to be shared. That's not correct. To racial injustice, that needs to be confronted. So let's call it what it is, white supremacy. And not only that, the lie of white supremacy. And let's go one step further, the abhorrent lie of white supremacy. The next thing we have to get very clear is this is not a partisan issue. It's not that the Democrats get it right, the Republicans have it wrong, or vice versa. White supremacy is a bipartisan unifying notion in America. So our last election was about what? Greatness, right? President Trump said what? Make America great again. What did Hillary say? We're already great. So they actually had a huge level of agreement. Our past, our history, our foundations are great. They disagreed if we were great today. Hillary said yes, Donald said no. The Democratic National Convention, President Obama jumped into the fray and says America's already great. Cory Booker, an African-American senator from New Jersey, he is standing at the center stage of the DNC. He's endorsing Hillary Clinton. In his speech, he acknowledges the word savages in the Declaration. He acknowledges that women are excluded from the Constitution, and he acknowledges the Three-Fifths Compromise. Most national politicians don't acknowledge any of those things. He acknowledges all three of them. But he saves his future political ambitions by telling the mostly white crowd, but these things do not detract from our nation's greatness. It's like, really? I would beg to differ. It's like clinging to a life preserver after the Titanic sank and saying that was a good ship. So we tend to think this last election was about racism versus anti-racism. It wasn't. They agreed our past, our history, our foundations are great. This election was about, do we want Donald to make us explicitly racist again, or do we want Hillary to work to keep our racism and sexism implicit?
That's right.
And we elected the implicit, we voted for the implicit, but we got the explicit because the system is written to protect who? White landowning men. This was no shock. This election was not a mistake. This was no great feat. We had a white landowning man against a woman. If you've read our Constitution, you know who's going to win before we even vote. Especially after somehow a black man got in there 8 years earlier. Well, we're not going to let that happen again. There's no way that's going to happen. So the fourth thing we have to conclude on is our foundations. Most people think America is racist and sexist in spite of our foundations. That's not true. We are racist and sexist because of our foundations. Let me help you understand this. So in 1452, Pope Nicholas V writes out these words: invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively become known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human, and the land is yours for the taking. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They did not believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world already inhabited by millions and claim to have discovered it. You cannot discover lands already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your car keys, your laptops out. I'll come by and discover them for you. This isn't discovery, right? It's stealing. It's conquering. It's colonizing. The fact that to this day we have monuments and history books and lectures identifying Columbus as the discoverer of America reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is native peoples, people of color, are not fully human. This makes the Declaration of Independence, or the Doctrine of Discovery, a white supremacist doctrine. Now, the challenge is this doctrine has been embedded into the foundations of the nation. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he says to the colonies who are here that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonies. They want access to those lands. So a few years later, they write a letter of protest. In their letter, they accuse the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They go on in the letter to cite that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason our founding fathers used this inclusive term, all men, because they had a very narrow definition of who is actually human. This makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist document. Now, a few years later, our founding fathers wrote another document. They started this one with the words, "We the people," or to form a more perfect union. This, of course, is a preamble to the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 of this Constitution, the section that determines who is and who is not included in this union, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. Article 1, Section 2, the first thing we have to note is it never mentions women. This is important because if you read the Constitution from the preamble through the last amendment, you will count 51 gender-specific male pronouns. Who can run for office, who can hold office, who is protected by this Constitution. 51 gender-specific male pronouns, not a single female pronoun. So second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? white landowning men. This is who could vote. We have to ponder this. The purpose of the Constitution, the reason we have it, is to protect the interests of white landowning men. So today we act surprised that women earn 70 cents to the dollar. This shouldn't surprise us. Constitution's working. We act surprised our prisons are filled with people of color. Shouldn't surprise us. Constitution's working. We get upset that in 2010 the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This opens the door for super PACs, unlimited contributions to candidates. This should not surprise us. The Constitution is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. So this makes our Constitution a systemically white supremacist and sexist document. Now, in 1823, we had a Supreme Court case. It was Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent. They're in litigation over a single piece of land. One of them gets the land from a native tribe. The other one gets the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The court had to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. They ruled the principle for land titles was discovery, which gave title to the land. They then referenced the doctrine of discovery as a legal instrument and used that to determine that natives who were here first but are less than human, we only have what's called aboriginal title, the right of occupancy to the land, like a fish occupies water, a bird occupies air, and Europeans have the fee title to the land, the right of discovery to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. This case, along with a few others in the 1820s, creates the legal precedent for land titles. This precedent and the doctrine of discovery get referenced by the court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. This makes the United States Supreme Court a systemically white supremacist court that to this day has legal precedent based on the dehumanization of people of color. Now, one of the challenges we face in this nation, one of the reasons we don't have a common memory is because we have never lost a war. Because who writes history? The victors, right? Let me prove this to you. What is the single most deadliest 24-hour period man-made in human history? Who can tell me? Hiroshima is one guess. What? That man-made, but that was one. Any other guesses? I can tell who was educated in the American educational system. Massacre at Wounded Knee, not quite, but that's a good guess. The single most deadly 24-hour period in world history, man-made, was Operation Meeting House in March of 1945, which is when we carpet bombed Tokyo. 2,000 pounds of incendiary bombs dropped by over 300 airplanes and killed 100,000 people in a single night. Should imagine with me for a moment, if history is written by the victors, how would history look if Germany won World War II? If history is written by the victors, how would history look if Germany won World War II? What would they think of Hitler? How great. He'd be amazing, right? Aryan supremacy, ridded them of the Jews, empowered this disempowered nation. So one of the things you have to recognize is when history is written by the victors and you're the victors, there are things you celebrate, there are things you dismiss, there are things you justify, and there are things you ignore because history is written by the victors. And I want to help you understand how deeply this is a part of our American history. Abraham Lincoln is, by consensus, considered the greatest president in American history. Sometimes George Washington challenges him, but especially as race relations have gotten worse in the past few decades, it is a national consensus that Abraham Lincoln is our greatest president. The reason we believe he's our greatest president is because he's the great emancipator, he's the great unifier, he won the Civil War, and he abolished slavery. The problem is, history is written by the victors. So in 1858, Abraham Lincoln was in a heated political race for the Illinois Senate. He was running against Stephen Douglas and against this perception that he wanted to free the slaves. So early on in this series, they had 7 debates with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the first debates, he gave a speech, and he started his speech by telling the people, I will say here upon this subject that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black race. There is a physical difference between the two races, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid their living together on the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position. In the fourth debate, a month later, he reiterated himself almost verbatim. I will say then that I am not nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. Applause. That I am not nor ever have been in favor of making judges or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to that, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two of living in terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so, while they must remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. After his inauguration in 1860, or in his inauguration, he felt a need to address this one more time. He said, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property, i.e. their slaves, and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. I declare that I have no purpose. And now he's quoting himself from the first debate, making it very clear how he felt about race and what he really thought about slavery. After he came to office in 1862, in May of 1862, he signs the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act opens up land and promises 160 acres to any U.S. citizen that moves out west and homesteads the land. In July of 1862, he also signs the Pacific Railway Act. The Pacific Railway Act is what completes the Transcontinental Railway. It had made it as far as Omaha, Nebraska, and this provides the land and the funding to get it all the way to the West Coast. A transcontinental railway, as well as a transcontinental telegraph line. He is signing this bill to do what? Complete manifest destiny. In 1862, he has the Emancipation Proclamation written. It's in his desk. Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, writes a scathing op-ed calling for the immediate emancipation of the slaves. Now, Lincoln is afraid because there are 4 states which haven't seceded from the Union that allow slavery: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And he is afraid of what these slave-owning states are going to think if he releases the Emancipation Proclamation. So he instead responds to Horace Greeley with this letter and says that if there would be any who would save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. This bold part of the quote is hanging in a plaque at the Lincoln Memorial, announcing to everyone who visits Lincoln's belief that black lives do not matter. In 1863, the Dakota people signed a treaty with the U.S. government. 1861, I'm sorry. They signed a treaty with the U.S. government that in exchange for some lands, they would get provisions for the winters, and they would get shelter and health care and things like that. And the U.S. government was not meeting their treaty obligations. So they went through a brutal winter in 61. In 62, one day some of their young men were out and they came across a white settlement. And on a dare, one of them went in and stole some eggs, and he killed a few of the settlers. They went back and told their people what they did. And the elders, begrudgingly, against what they wanted to do, but because they saw the direness of the situation, they decided to have a war council and declare war, because otherwise they were not going to make it through another winter. This opened up a 37-day war period. It was bloody. There were killings on both sides. End of that 37 days, half of the native warriors fled north to Canada. The other half turned themselves in. They were immediately put into military tribunals. They were now judged by the same people who they were just fighting against a few days earlier. These tribunals happened in succession. They shared witnesses. They were in a foreign language. At the end, over 300 of them were condemned to die. Because these were military tribunals, they had to be approved by the president, so they went to Abraham Lincoln's desk. 303 hangings was a bit too genocidal for Lincoln. But even though these trials were a sham, he didn't order retrials. He simply changed the criteria of what warranted a death sentence. Under his new criteria, only 2 people were scheduled to die. Now he was afraid his white settlers were going to rise up. So instead of ordering retrials a second time, he merely changed the criteria again. Now he landed on the magic number of 39. So the day after Christmas, 1862, the largest mass execution in the history of America took place with the hanging of the Dakota 38. 4,000 white settlers came out and sang hymns of praise as these men were hanged. A few days later, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Now, if you've ever read the Emancipation Proclamation, it is very specific as to where slaves are freed. We have Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. What's missing from this list? Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. He did not free the slaves in the northern slave-owning states, and in fact, where accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. Slaves in those 4 states did not get their freedom until after Lincoln died. In February of 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed a bill nullifying the treaties with all the tribes in Minnesota. In March of 63, he signed another bill giving him as president the permission to remove the tribes from Minnesota. After the war and before the hanging of the Dakota 38, the U.S. Army put a bounty on the president or the chiefs of the Dakota tribes. In April, the removal of the Dakota people and other tribes from Minnesota began. They were hunted down. They were gathered together near Minneapolis, and they were put on trains and boats, inhumane conditions, and bused to South Dakota territory. Empowered by the bounty put on by the federal government, the state of Minnesota put a bounty on any native head. They started a militia, and they paid their militia members $2 a day plus $25 for any scalp that they collected. To encourage the general population to get in on the fray, they offered a bounty for non-militia members of $75. The militia lasted for 60 days. At the end of the 60 days in July, they upped the bounty for citizens to $200. The chief was intentionally killed, but unwillingly known it was the chief. They later learned who he was. They brought him, this was on July 2nd or 3rd, they brought him into the village nearby where he was killed. And on July 4th, they gave the children permission to put firecrackers in his nose and nostrils and explode them as part of their celebration. By June and July of 63, all of the natives have been removed from Minnesota. They are now living in prison-like conditions in the South Dakota Territory at the Croat Reservation. In 1863, General Carleton of the U.S. Army, of which President Lincoln was commander-in-chief, gave this order to one of his officers in New Mexico. Henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or move. There can be no other talk on the subject. Kit Carson, who was the officer he gave this order to, then went through my people's land, the Navajo lands. They killed all of our livestock, they burned all of our crops, they destroyed all of our homes, and they kept us moving throughout our territory, throughout our lands, never letting us rest, never letting us catch our breath, always keeping us on the move. And Raymond Friday Locke, in his historical analysis of the Navajo people, recorded that by the middle of December, most of the weak and aged had died. There's hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandmother, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back and forth to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by the army patrols or taken captives by the slave raiders. I was discussing this with someone back in New Mexico just a few weeks ago. And this person said, oh yeah, I just heard a story the other day from one of the families that were in this situation, and the mother was holding her child. The mother was holding her child, and the patrol came up and they were afraid of being captured, and so she pressed her hand through the soft spot in her child's head to kill her so that they wouldn't be discovered. In December of 1860, or January of 1863, Abraham Lincoln approves the creation of Bosque Redondo. Bosque Redondo is the death camp that our people were marched to after General Carleton ordered the removal of us from the territory of New Mexico. At this camp, over 10,000 Navajo men, women, and children were marched there. Approximately 200 died of starvation exposure during the walks, and over almost a quarter of them died while imprisoned in the squalor conditions at this camp. My great-grandfather was at Bosque Redondo. In his annual message in December of 63, Abraham Lincoln announced to Congress that we have opened up 1.4 million acres under the Homestead Law. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the second half of the Pacific Railway Act. This doubled the amount of land given to the railways to complete Manifest Destiny, and allowed us to go further. In 1864, so if you go back to 1851, the U.S. government signed a treaty with the Cheyenne and the Arapaho people, essentially giving them the territory of what is now Colorado. 2 or 3 years later, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains, and settlers and prospectors began encroaching on that land. In 1864, Colonel Shivington, who was a Methodist pastor, was marching through Colorado, and he came across an encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children, about 200 of them. They were waving a white flag of surrender and an American flag to show they were there peacefully. He ordered all of them slaughtered. It's later reported the soldiers paraded their genitalia down the streets of Denver. At first, this massacre was celebrated. As the gory details came out, it was investigated, and Colonel Shivington was reprimanded, but he was then allowed to retire. Within a year and a half after this removal, after this massacre, another treaty was signed with the Cheyenne and Arapaho, removing them from Colorado to where the reservation is now in Oklahoma. In his annual message in 1864, Abraham Lincoln announced that 1.5 million acres were entered in upon the Homestead Law, and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railways and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. They had 3 proposed routes for the Transcontinental Railway. The northern route began in Duluth. It went through Minnesota to the Pacific Northwest. The central route began in Omaha. It went through northern Colorado and southern Wyoming, and it went to the Pacific. And the southern route went through the territory of New Mexico. Within 2 years of signing the Pacific Railway Act, Abraham Lincoln ethnically cleansed the natives from Minnesota, from Colorado, and from New Mexico. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment. What does the 13th Amendment do? Abolish slavery is what some people think. This is what we think it says. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as shall exist within the United States. Now, hold on. Now, to understand this amendment, you have to understand Lincoln. So in the Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas widely, hugely, massively agreed in white supremacy. They disagreed about slavery. Stephen Douglas was arguing that we need the institution of slavery to keep white supremacy intact. Abraham Lincoln was arguing, no, we can keep white supremacy intact even without the institution of slavery. This was their debate they were having. Stephen Douglas accused Abraham Lincoln of applying the Declaration of Independence to black people. This is what Abraham Lincoln said. I think the authors of that notable instrument were intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. Now, he's not talking about individual people, he's talking about race. Later, Stephen Douglas accused Lincoln of wanting to make citizens of Negroes. And he responded, Judge Douglas has said that he has never been able to get from me an answer to the question of whether I'm in favor of Negro citizenship. So as far as I know, the judge has never asked me the question before. He shall have no occasion to ask it again, for I will tell him very frankly that I am not in favor of Negro citizenship. Now, in my opinion, is that the different states have the power to make a Negro a citizen under the Constitution of the U.S., but if the state of Illinois had the power, I should be opposed to the exercise of it. So Abraham Lincoln had a dilemma. He wanted to get rid of slavery, but whites were still superior, and he didn't know what to do with black people. The 13th Amendment was his solution. You create a subclass of citizenship where black people, people of color, have to live in constant fear of a white judge or white law enforcement officers removing their rights of citizenship at any given moment. Mass incarceration is not a mistake. It's not circumstances. This is the plan. This is the tool given to the country by Abraham Lincoln of how to keep white supremacy intact without the institution of slave ownership. And it's working very well. We incarcerate our people at the highest rate of any country in the world. We incarcerate our people of color at an overwhelming rate, even above white people. We incarcerate African Americans at the highest rate of any race in our country. In fact, we have more than double the amount of people, African American males, over the age of 15, under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system today than we had in slaves in 1850. So why is Abraham Lincoln our greatest president? Why?
He won the war.
He's not the great emancipator. He unified white people under the umbrella of white supremacy. The war he won was not the Civil War. The Civil War was an internal conflict. He said in the Lincoln debates, what is it that we hold most dear amongst us? Talking to a room of white landowning men. Our own liberty and prosperity. What has ever threatened our liberty and prosperity save and accept this institution of slavery? What he's arguing is slavery is going to tear us apart internally. We're going to kill each other over this. What he argued frequently throughout the debates is let's either become a completely slave nation or a completely free nation. None of this internal squabble. The war that he won was not the Civil War. That was an internal battle. The war he won was the war of manifest destiny. Think if he had won the Civil War but not been able to ethnically cleanse the natives from Minnesota, the natives from Colorado, and the natives from New Mexico, and we never would have made the Transcontinental Railway completed. This is the war we were fighting. This is why today the Lincoln Memorial is modeled after the Parthenon, the temple to the Greek goddess Athena. This is why we've engraved his face on a national monument. I want you to think back a year ago, not even a year ago, just a few months ago, last summer. There was a terrorist attack in London. Many people were killed. The day of that terrorist attack, Clay Higgins, who's the representative from Louisiana's 3rd District, on the day of that attack, on his public Facebook page, this is what he wrote. The free world, all of Christendom, is at war with Islamic horror. Not one penny of American treasure should be granted to any nation who harbors these heathen animals. Not a single radicalized Islamic suspect should be granted any measure of quarter. Their intended entry to the American homeland should be summarily denied. Every conceivable measure should be engaged to hunt them down, hunt them, identify them, and kill them all. For the sake of all that is good and righteous, kill them all. This is a U.S. congressman last summer. Not only am I appalled it said this, Facebook didn't take it down as hate speech. Remember, this is not a partisan issue. This is not the Democrats get it, the Republicans don't, or vice versa. This is a bipartisan issue. American exceptionalism, which is rooted in the lie of white supremacy, is what unifies our nation. This is what holds us together. If you want to get everyone on the same page, you embrace American exceptionalism. This is why I am so convinced we have to create this common memory. We need to find a way to tell these stories. We have to find a way to deal with this. Remember when I asked earlier, how would Nazi Germany celebrate Hitler had they won the war? I'm convinced they would celebrate him exactly the way we celebrate Lincoln. The problem is not that Lincoln is so similar to Hitler. The problem is that we are not much different from Nazi Germany. We have to find a way to create this common memory. In his last State of the Union, President Obama was talking about the need for a new politics. And he said, we the people. Our Constitution begins with these 3 simple words. Words we've come to recognize mean all the people. That sounds beautiful. It's a lie. When did we ever decide nationally, collectively, that we the people means all the people? The Founding Fathers didn't mean it. Abraham Lincoln didn't believe it. The Civil Rights Movement didn't get us there. President Trump doesn't believe it. The problem is we've never collectively decided, do we want to be a nation where we the people means all the people? This is the conversation we have to talk about, people. This is the dialogue we have to have. Because if we want to be a nation where we the people means all the people, we have to make some fundamental changes to our foundations. We have to examine some very, very tough history and make some radical decisions of what we're going to do to change this and to correct it. And that's the dialogue that Brian and I want to engage you in. That's the conversation we want to have with you. I don't know how much time we have left, but we would love to answer some questions and to bring in some conversation.
Yes.
Okay.